Again, Psalm 23:4. I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. We see the place and circumstance of David. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. This is a place where there is the presence and there is the threat of death, indicated by the shadow of death. And it is also a place of fear and a place of evil, indicated by I will fear no evil. The assurance and confidence of David in this place is I will fear no evil. The reason for thou art with me. So, thou art with me is the basis of his assurance, his confidence. And this is in spite of the valley of the shadow of death. So it is an assurance and confidence based in thou. And thou in relation to me. Thou with me. So the impact and effect of such is an enjoyment of God rather than a fear of the place and circumstance. So we see David here has victory over fear. Even though I will fear no evil. Now fear is an unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that the belief can be based in reality or it may not be based in reality at all. But it's caused by the belief that someone or something is dangerous or threatening. Now, fear, of course, is a God-given emotion for our own protection, our own benefit. It's fear that keeps you from stepping out in front of a semi. So it's for our own protection. It's for our own benefit. It motivates us to avoid impending danger. But fear also, of course, can be destructive. And it is a very powerful tool of Satan. In fact, I believe it's one of his most powerful and dominant weapons that he uses to torment the people of God and also to dictate adverse feelings and behavior. And it is this kind of fear, not the fear that's given us for our protection, but this fear that Satan uses. It's this kind of fear that the Bible repeatedly warns against and it's this kind of fear that makes an individual extremely vulnerable to further satanic attack. So fear is, of course, a very powerful force. It has a debilitating and crippling power. It can, again, make us unable. Matthew 14:29-30, Peter, when he saw the waves, was afraid. And he began to sink. It's fear. It was fear that caused him to sink, and he lost his ability to walk on water. And fear will rob an individual of ability. Fear has an enslaving and paralyzing power. In Proverbs chapter 29, if we turn there, Proverbs 29, verse 25, Proverbs 29, verse 25, the fear of man bringeth a snare. It is an entanglement, a trap, enslaving power. Fear causes men, we see in John, notice in John chapter 7, verse 13, howbeit no man spake openly of him for fear of the Jews. Fear controlled them, caused them to, it paralyzed them. They would not speak of Jesus Christ. We see the parents of the blind man in John chapter 9. John 9, verse 22 says, these words spake his parents because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess that he was Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. So fear has a very destructive power. In John chapter 12, verse 42. John 12, verse 42. Nevertheless, among the chief rulers also many believed on him, but because of the Pharisees they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. There was fear. They were fearful of man. And again, Proverbs 29:25, the fear of man bringeth a snare. In Luke chapter 21, we see fear makes the hearts of man to fail. Luke 21, speaking of end times, verse 26, men's hearts failing them for fear. That means their hearts swoon, their hearts faint, their hearts are ready to die. They become hopeless because of fear. Fear has the power to impair the mind. It's hard to reason with someone who is given over to fear, because fear impairs the mind, renders one not to be able to think reasonably. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7. For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power, and of love, and of a sound mind. So you see here that this kind of fear is contrary to a sound mind. Now it appears in verse 6, Paul, again, Timothy is the pastor at the church of Ephesus, and Ephesus was a very wicked city. And verse 6, wherefore I put thee in remembrance that thou stir up the gift of God which is in thee by the putting on of my hands. It appears, and then he says, for God hath not given us the spirit of fear. So it appeared that Timothy was given over to fear at this time. And so Paul writes these words, for God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. A mind free from decay. A healthy, sensible, and strong mind. A sound mind is a mind clear. It is clear and unclouded thinking. Fear clouds the mind. Fear makes it difficult to think reasonably. So from this we see that fear has a powerful effect upon perception. And yet we hear David say, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. He has victory. He has victory over fear. Now, what gives victory over fear? Well, it's faith. And he states that. He says, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. How do you know God's with you? Faith. Faith. So we see faith is what gives victory over fear. So David, because of a realization of thou art with me, is able to rise and live above the valley of the shadow of death and the fear that is associated with the valley of the shadow of death. So this is faith. I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. The object of faith, faith has to have an object. The object of faith is thou art with me. He believes that. Faith causes us to see. He sees that. Faith causes something to be real. This becomes real. He has faith. And because of faith, he has victory over fear. Therefore, he has victory over the valley of the shadow of death. Faith caused thou art with me to be very real. Faith caused thou art with me to be more than the valley of the shadow of death. It's not that he becomes oblivious to the valley of the shadow of death, unaware of the valley of the shadow of death, but thou art with me becomes more real than the valley of the shadow of death. It becomes more than the valley of the shadow of death. When the valley of the shadow of death is more than your perception of God, you're in trouble. And again, this is where faith comes in. Jesus asked his own in Mark 4, in verse 40, he said, why are you so fearful? And then he answers the question. He didn't even give them a chance to answer. He answers the question in his next statement. O ye of little faith, why are you so fearful? O ye of little faith. Also a lack of faith results in fear, of course, but it also results in human reasoning, which only fuels fear. In Matthew 16, verse 8, Jesus said, O ye of little faith, why reason ye among yourselves? And that's what fear does. Fear becomes unreasonable. I mean, you look at most phobias and most fears that people have, they're not even reasonable. But this is what fear does. It impairs the mind. So from these two statements, Mark 4, verse 40, Matthew 16, 8, these two statements of Christ, we see that faith, it is faith that raises one above fear. It is faith that raises one above human reasoning. Again, the devil uses human reasoning to fuel fear. Human reasoning and fear go together. So faith is what gives us the victory. Faith gives stability. Notice in 2 Chronicles chapter 20. 2 Chronicles chapter 20. And verse 20. Go about 2/3 of the way down. It says, believe in the Lord your God, so shall ye be established. That's stability. That's stability. So there's David in the valley of the shadow of death. And he says, I will fear no evil. He believes, thou art with me. He believes that. That gives him stability. So David in the valley of the shadow of death, and you and I as well, can have stability. You don't have to be shaken by the valley of the shadow of death and all that it entails. You don't have to be shaken by that. Faith causes us to be established, gives stability. You can walk through the valley of the shadow of death and have stability. Faith also gives joy and peace. Notice in Romans chapter 15, Romans 15 and verse 13. Now the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace, notice, in believing. In believing. It is believing that gives joy and peace. It is faith in God that gives joy and peace, that ye may abound. And it's this faith in God, this believing that causes us to abound. So walking through the valley of the shadow of death, one can have joy and peace if they believe. If they have enough faith to know, thou art with me, that gives joy and peace, and that causes one to abound, even in the valley of the shadow of death. In Ephesians 6 and verse 16, we see faith as a shield. That is, it protects us, it shields us against Satan's attacks. And faith in, thou art with me, shields us from Satan's attacks, and it gives us a sense of security in the valley. So one can walk through the valley of the shadow of death and have security. And have security. In fact, we ought to. If we walk through the valley of the shadow of death and we're unstable, and we don't have joy, and we don't have peace, and we don't feel a sense of security, whose fault is that? Well, it's our own. Because we don't have faith to believe. And someone can say, oh, I believe. Well, I'm sorry, you don't. If you don't have that sense of stability and that joy and peace and that sense of security, because faith brings those things. And if you don't have those things, it's because there's a lack of faith. It has nothing to do with the valley of the shadow of death. It has everything to do with our faith. So faith will also cause us to understand. Notice in Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11, verse 3. Through faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the Word of God. There's no sense in arguing with an evolutionist about creation. There's no point in it. Because it's faith that causes one to understand. You can't impart to them faith. And that's the only way they're going to understand. And so we see faith gives understanding. Faith gives clarity. So even when we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, we can have this clarity. If we have faith, thou art with me. And that faith causes us to understand, He's with me. Yes, the valley of the shadow of death is real. But He's with me. I understand that. And so we see we can go through the valley of the shadow of death with understanding. In other words, it dispels confusion. It dispels chaos. The valley of the shadow of death does not have to be chaotic. It does not have to be confusing. We just need faith. Faith draws in the direction of God. Well, of course, if the object of faith is God, then we're drawn in that direction. Notice in Acts chapter 11, we realize this is talking about salvation, but Acts chapter 11, verse 21, and the hand of the Lord was with them, and a great number believed. Okay, that's faith. as a result of believing and turned unto the Lord. That's what faith will do. Faith will turn us in the direction of God. So even in the valley of the shadow of death, David's heart and feet are going in the direction of God. And we always have to pay attention to what direction am I going? What direction is my mind going? Where am I headed in my thinking? Again, faith draws us in the right direction. So he says, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. He believed that God was with him, and he had victory over fear. And so it is with you and I. So God is the reason not to fear. That's the reason. That's the only reason. God is the reason not to fear. You tell somebody, well, don't be afraid of that. That can't hurt you. And that may be very true. But God is the reason not to fear. And we'll look at several verses. Let's go to Genesis chapter 15. We see all through the Old Testament, a few times in the New Testament, God tells us, fear not. Now, he's not talking about the fear that keeps you from laying on a railroad track. He's not talking about that. He's not talking about that God-given emotion that's for our protection and benefit. But he's talking about this fear that Satan uses. In Genesis 15, verse 1, after these things, the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision, saying, Fear not, Abram. And here's the reason. I am thy shield, and thy exceeding great reward. Fear not, I am. That's the reason. Not to fear. It's not fear not because everything's going to turn out well. No, that's not the reason. Fear not, I am. So you have to have faith. Faith believing that God is. Genesis 21. Genesis 21. Verse 17. The latter part of the verse. Fear not. This is Hagar. God speaking to Hagar. Fear not, for God hath heard. Fear not, for God. It's not, fear not, Hagar, everything's going to turn out okay. That's not the reason. It's fear not, for God. For God hath heard the voice of the lad where he is. Notice in Genesis 26 and verse 24. About halfway down. Fear not, for I am. Again, fear not, and then for what follows for is the reason not to fear. Fear not, for I am with thee, and will bless thee, and multiply thy seed for my servant Abraham's sake. So once again, God is the reason not to fear. For I am. Fear not, for I am. And I am with thee. And I am with thee to bless thee. Genesis 46. Genesis 46. And verse 3. And he said, I am God, the God of thy father. Fear not to go down into Egypt, for I will there make of thee a great nation. Now here we see the reason not to fear is stated before fear not. The reason is, I am God. the God of thy father. Fear not. Fear not to go down into Egypt. Followed by another reason. And the reason is based in God. For I will there, where I am leading you, I will there make of thee a great nation. In Deuteronomy chapter 20. Deuteronomy chapter 20. And verse 1. When thou goest out to battle against thine enemies, and seest horses and chariots, and a people more than thou, be not afraid of them. And then the reason. For the Lord thy God is with thee, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. God is the reason. God is the reason not to fear. In Deuteronomy chapter 31, in verse 6, be strong and of good courage. Fear not, nor be afraid of them. Then you have the reason. For the Lord thy God, He it is. For the Lord thy God, He it is that doth go with thee. He, God's the reason. He will not fail thee, nor forsake thee. Notice in verse 8, and the Lord said, He it is that doth go before thee. He will be with thee. He will not fail thee, neither forsake thee. Fear not, neither be dismayed. He says the same thing he said in verse 6, but he reverses the order. He gives the reason first, rather than the command first, not to fear. But either way, God's the reason. In Joshua chapter 10, verse 25. Joshua 10, verse 25. And Joshua said unto them, Fear not, nor be dismayed. Be strong and of good courage. That is, rather than fear, be strong and of good courage. Here's why. For thus shall the Lord do. For thus shall the Lord do. The reason is based upon what God will do. It's not based upon what man will do. It's based upon what God will do. In 2 Kings chapter 6. 2 Kings 6, verse 16. Fear not, for they that be with us are more than they that be with them. This is Elisha speaking to his servant. And again, it's a matter of faith to believe that. And if one believes that, there's no need to fear. So again, the reason is not based upon the power or the strength or the size of the enemy. The whole reason is based upon who God is and what God does. 2 Chronicles chapter 20. 2 Chronicles 20, verse 15. About 2/3 down again. Be not afraid, nor dismayed by reason of this great multitude, for the battle is not yours, but God's. So again, God is the reason. The battle's not ours. The battle is God's. 2 Chronicles 20, verse 17. Ye shall not need to fight in this battle. Set yourselves, stand still, and see the salvation of the Lord with you, O Judah and Jerusalem. Fear not, nor be dismayed. Tomorrow go out against them, for the Lord will be with you. And Isaiah 35. Isaiah 35. and verse 4. Isaiah 35, verse 4. He says, "Be strong, fear not. Behold your God." That's why you're to be strong. That's why you're not to fear. Behold your God. Behold your God will come with vengeance, that is, on your behalf. Even God with a recompense, He will come and save you. And that's all a matter of faith. So it's faith that gives victory over fear. In Isaiah 41, Isaiah 41 and verse 10. "Fear thou not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God." To be dismayed is a result of fear. "For I am thy God. I will strengthen thee. Yea, I will help thee. Yea, I will uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness." So you have 3 times, I will. Do not be afraid. Do not be dismayed. I will, I will, I will. So again, it's all based upon God. Notice verse 13 and verse 14. "For I, the Lord thy God, will hold thy right hand, saying unto thee, Fear not, I will help thee." That's the reason not to fear. "Fear not, thou worm Jacob, and ye men of Israel, I will." Again, God is the reason. "I will help thee, saith the Lord, and thy Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel." In Isaiah 43, verse 1, he says, "Fear not, for I have redeemed thee. I have called thee by thy name. Thou art mine." So we're not to fear because of what God has already done. He has redeemed us, He has called us, and we're not to fear because of our position with Him. Thou art mine. In other words, I'll take care of you. You belong to me, and I will take care of you. Isaiah 43:5. "Fear not, for I am with thee. I will." There it is again. I will. God is with us. Not only with us, but God does a work while He's with us. Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 8. "Be not afraid of their faces, for I am with thee to deliver thee, saith the Lord." Notice in Jeremiah 42, verse 11. Jeremiah 42, verse 11. "Be not afraid of the king of Babylon, of whom ye are afraid. Be not afraid of him." So twice, be not afraid, be not afraid, saith the Lord, "for I." Be not afraid, for I am with you to save you and to deliver you from His hand. In Matthew 14, apostles are out in the storm. In Matthew 14, verse 27, they're afraid because of their imaginations. They think they see a ghost. He says, "Be of good cheer," which is another way of saying be of good courage. "It is I. Be not afraid." It is I. That's the reason. That's the reason not to fear. And then lastly, in Revelation 1, verse 17. Revelation 1, verse 17. "When I saw him, I fell at his feet as dead. And he laid his right hand upon me, saying unto me, Fear not, I am. Fear not, I am the first and the last." So you see, it doesn't matter what's in the valley. It doesn't, that's not the issue. That's not what matters. And whatever it is that's in that valley is not more than God and is not equal to God. And if we want victory over the valley of the shadow of death, and we want victory over fear, then we have to have faith. Thou art with me has to be real. And how real is that? Well, that depends. How real it is to us depends upon our degree of faith. I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. So we know that the child of God does not have to live in the grip and in the chains of fear, but the child of God can live victorious through the blessed assurance of thou art with me. And in that, we find refreshment, we find hope. Again, it doesn't matter what the valley is. Believing that, we find strength, we find edification, we find joy, rejuvenation, there's rest, there's relief, there's deliverance, there's fulfillment, there's a sense of contentment and peace, stability, security, and victory. And here in the 23rd Psalm, that is for all the days of my life. Whatever the valleys be, all the days of my life, thou art with me. And it's a matter of, for you and I anyway, from our aspect, how much do we believe that? And that's what determines whether the valley takes possession of us or we triumph over the valley of the shadow of death. But the point is that the child of God, because of the presence of the Lord, can live above fear, can live above whatever valley that we might have to pass through in this life. Brother Ben, if you'll come and lead us